Hello.
Hello, James. I can hear you, and I can also see you.
Oh, really? I'm coming through because I had a hard time. I didn't know whether I could get an image through, but here I am.
You are indeed. I was just going to wait 1 second. Aaron's camera doesn't seem to be working. And Aaron, how many times do I have to tell you, Aaron? Mute your microphone when you're typing. But sorry, James. It's an absolute delight to have you on the show for the second year in a row. And you are looking well and healthy. How do you do it? Is it that homeopathic remedy that you're taking?
It's sorcery. There's no question about it. Total sorcery. I have magic beans in the other room, you see.
I'm sure you do. James, in the build-up to this program, we set up a website, and your appearance was mentioned there, and there were a number of comments that people left, and some of those I'm going to come to, and hopefully take a couple of calls from people who left specific questions for you. But I'd like to start, if I can, with something more recent, because as a subscriber to the JREF, I was aware that I think about a month ago you made an appearance on Nightline, in which...
Yes.
Do you want to explain that?
Yes, that was a bit of a surprise. We had to do it sort of at the last moment. Pardon me, I'm overcome with emotion, as you can see.
It often happens in front of me.
James von Prague and Alison Dubois, both acclaimed, quote, psychics, unquote. Whenever I say psychics, that's in quotation marks, as you understand, I'm sure. They appeared on there, and they were pretty well wiped out. Our good friend Banachek, the mentalist, who is quite frank about saying that he is a mentalist, that is, he's performing tricks for entertainment purposes. He never takes money under false pretenses, as these people do. He pretty well wiped them out because he tested them. They agreed to be tested, and they were tested, and they failed, to say the least. So it was quite a bit of a victory for the James Randi Educational Foundation, and we've not heard from them since for some strange reason. But it was a good encounter, I must say.
There's another person that you haven't heard from for a while. I'll come back to her in a second. But the person you just mentioned, he was one of the two people, I think, that was involved in your Operation Alpha. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, no, Banachek, yes. Banachek was one of the Alpha kids, as we called them. Pardon me. He was a young magician who wrote me. I was also assailed by several other letters at the time, but the two that got my attention were the one from Banachek and from another fellow, Michael. And these two guys wrote me separately, not knowing one another, and they simply said, if you ever get a chance to infiltrate a parapsychological lab where they don't know what they're doing, and all of them don't know what they're doing, in my estimation, I'd be glad to go in there. So I got the two of them together, and I sent them in. And by golly, it was a huge success. Now, I must say, huge success in this, that it exposed to the world the fact that the parapsychologists think they're so smart they can't be fooled by kids. And kids are very good at fooling adults, as you be aware. Anyone who has children will verify that. But the bottom line of the thing was that we exposed the hoax before these scientists at the lab had the chance to make real fools of themselves, and before they had a chance to declare that this was all absolutely genuine. And they reissued their paper they were going to present at a conference by putting in modifiers like apparently and they claimed that, and a few things like that. They changed the meaning of the paper altogether, and they got off the hook by that means. We didn't embarrass them academically. We gave them the chance to turn around in their tracks, and they did effectively.
And I suspect a lot of people are aware of it, but I mean, these people were fooled by really very simplistic sleight of hand, weren't they? And,
yes.
Would you put that down to the fact that they had this overwhelming desire to actually believe?
actually not only desire and need to believe. After all, a parapsychologist deals only with parapsychology, and parapsychology doesn't have a foot to stand on, let alone 2 feet to stand on. Parapsychology has not passed the test that science demands of it in order to be a legitimate study. There have been all kinds of claims. There are claims every day, every few hours in many cases around the world for all kinds of wonderful discoveries in telepathy and prophecy and various other aspects of parapsychology. But when they're tested, in the long run, they fail.
Aaron, again, if you just mute your microphone, if you're not speaking, there's a bit of background noise from you. Thank you. One of the people that I was referring to earlier on when I said there's somebody that you haven't heard from for a while, Aaron, your microphone's still not muted. Thank you. One of the people that I was referring to is Sylvia Browne. Tell us about her and how long has it been that she has not been able to find you in the telephone directory?
I'm glad you know about that. That's a bit of a revelation. Yes, now this is a person, are you ready? This is a person who talks to dead people. And I'm in the phone directory. In fact, just recently, there are 1.2 million references to me and to the James Randi Educational Foundation on Skype. Not on Skype, on Google, but also on Skype. And she can't find us. I'm in the telephone directory. So I sent her a registered letter with a different return address on it, or she wouldn't have accepted it, I'm sure. And I told her the names of my brother and sister up in Canada, relatives all over the world, and the way that I could be reached through them if she couldn't use the telephone directory. And we haven't heard from her. What is it? Going on 9 years now since she agreed on the Larry King live show to be tested by the James Randi Educational Foundation. Now she says, first of all, she said she couldn't find me. And then she changed the story to say that I'm not a godly man and therefore she won't deal with me. Wouldn't that be all the more reason she'd want to deal with me and take away the $1 million? Now, mind you, it's not my $1 million, belongs to the foundation, but that would be sort of revenge on her part if she could do it. But apparently she can't, or doesn't want to.
Well, that excuse, I think, is comparable to the one put forward by another of these. I know that you're probably reluctant to say it, but I'm free to do so. Dishonest people like John Edwards, who does the same cold reading trick.
Oh, yes.
And
yeah.
his excuse for not being tested by you is that he would not be tested by a man whose first name was an adjective.
Yes. Now that was Glenn. What's his name? I've forgotten his name now, but he was on CNN at the time. Now that's interesting because this guy Glenn, he allowed himself to be segued right out of it. He said this to John Edward, and John Edward made this joke, and the host of the show immediately dropped it and went on to something else instead of asking him to answer the question. Edward is pretty canny, you know. He knows how to get out of these things because the hosts that he appears with are not terribly smart.
What I find really funny about his technique and all the cold reading, people doing cold reading, when they come out in front of the audience, and let's assume they are doing cold reading as opposed to the fairly hot reading that the likes of Popoff used to do. Mm-hmm. And they come out and they say, I'm getting a J. I'm getting a... Now, what's interesting is that the letters that they choose are the letters that are most frequent beginning of anyone's name. I've never seen one of these people come out and say, I'm getting a Z.
Or a Z, for that matter.
Sorry. I forgot,
or a Q or something like that, yes.
Yeah.
They depend on the odds, of course.
Well, I'd like to throw something in here, too. I mean, I got some email from somebody that said that he was going to be tested by James Randi and he was going to take away James Randi's $1 million by proving that they were reptiles in charge of the government, specifically reptiles that had evolved on Earth but moved to some planet orbiting Sirius and that had come back to the Earth and then created humanity to use as a slave species, which they secretly manipulate behind the government curtains.
You don't suppose that a religion might have been founded on this? I couldn't believe if that's the case.
Well, that's actually quite an interesting segue into one of the topics that I wanted to discuss. I'm going to come back to cold reading in a second, but many of the comments that were left on the webpage did actually relate to the most interesting claims that you've had for the $1 million. And firstly, I'm sure that you would want to make this clear, as you have said, it's not your $1 million. That $1 million is there, and I'm sure that you'd be very, very happy to give it away.
Well, I'm not too happy to give it away. No, please don't put thoughts in my mind like that. No, I'd give it away to my next door neighbor and share it with him otherwise. But no, we wouldn't be happy to give it away. But if we did give it away, we could make it back easily because we get Nobel Prizes. We would have proven something that has never been proven before. So we really can't lose, can we?
That was my point. Of the weird claims that have been made, there are two that stick in my mind, and they may not be the most risible ones that you remember. But there was the man from, I think it was Mexico, that glowed in the dark.
Yes, very briefly, a gentleman, this happens every now and then, at the foundation headquarters that we had in Fort Lauderdale, one Monday morning at about 10 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock on the door, and my receptionist answered, and she came to me and she said, there's a man from Mexico here with a suitcase, and he's arrived because he wants to take the $1 million back to Mexico with him. And I said, well, that's not the way we do it. We have to make an application first, but we'll entertain. I took him into the library, which was it could close off, so there was no light coming in from the outside. It was in the center of the building. And he announced to me that he glows in the dark. And I said, well, we can certainly test that in a big hurry. And I called a couple of the staff in, and they stood around the room, and we turned out the lights, and we couldn't see him. And he told us, well, everyone else can see me. You can't see me? And I said, wait a minute, wait. So we went to the front door, and there were a couple of passers-by, neighbors from down the street. I said, come on in, you're going to be a witness. They couldn't see him either. Well, the poor chap, now, he was very poorly dressed, and I think he had probably come in by bus from Mexico somehow or another. And that suitcase was empty. It was a huge suitcase, because $1 million takes a lot of room, And it was empty. All he had in there perhaps was a toothbrush, I don't know, but he had arrived with an empty suitcase to take the $1 million back with him. And we showed him to the door, and he went out the door looking very dejected, and that's understandable. But the poor chap, he really believed that he glowed in the dark, and that was supernatural, and that he had been touched by a UFO. That was his claim. But he didn't glow in the dark. It's very sad. There is
a difference, isn't there, between those that are obviously deluded, like he was, and those who are consciously dishonest, like John Edward is.
Oh, yes.
And again, that's another point I want to come back to. But very briefly, again, I think there were the Magnetic Ladies of Lithuania.
Yes.
Tell us about them.
Yeah, that's another person that showed up on a Monday morning. Our Monday mornings are always delightful, of course, as you can see. And showed up at the door with a couple of interpreters. And she was from Lithuania. And we invited her in, sat her down in the library. Now, this is not what we normally do, you understand, because they have to make application in advance, by mail or by email, and then we agree on what the test will be, etc. It's on our website, which happens to be at randi.org, in case you were wondering. And she showed up, and she said that she could diagnose illness, you see. So I said, well, go ahead, do it on me. I accept that the web the internet is all full of information about what I've recently undergone. And indeed, she fed all that back to me. And then I called in, as a matter of fact, that was David Steigelman, our TV man at that time. And I called him in. He had a couple of defects of his physical body. And she guessed and guessed and guessed. And she nodded at him as if he was going to nod yes. And he quite honestly answered, she didn't get two major ailments that the gentleman had, major ailments that he had, and she didn't detect. And she said, oh, it was all because of the negative vibrations that were around. Those are dreadful things, those negative vibrations, as we know, that defeats these people from time to time.
And they always seem to be very close to you for some reason.
Yes, I don't know what it is. My body is just vibrating all the time with negative vibrations. Anyway, she went away, but the bottom line on this story, and she had lawyers with her. A couple of the people that were outside were lawyers, and they wanted to talk to me too, and I talked to them, but nothing came of it. But she actually went back, and the president of her country, of Lithuania, actually took her on and gave her a location somewhere in the governmental buildings so she'd be on hand to heal him and or diagnose him when necessary. So she rose to great heights. Whether she's still there, I don't know, and I don't much care.
Wow. Sorry, Aaron, do go on.
No, I was just impressed at that story. I mean, how somebody takes, and you hear it in politics all the time. You know, there isn't any adequate skepticism from the leaders, apparently, of any country. You know, that they should have some demonstrable ability before you start giving them these accolades. And look at, like, you know, Sarah Palin would do it with her hands-on thing with the guy that was burning children for being witches. I mean, this is what our leadership does. I mean, how many stories do we hear like this? Not just from this country, but from others as well.
Oh yes, we're just as guilty as other. We're supposed to be the greatest nation on earth. Come on, let's start to act like it. Let's get smart, shall we?
Yeah, definitely.
It's a little bit difficult when you've got the likes of Rick Perry around, but we've mentioned that before. Many of the comments that were left on the website also dealt with this particular issue, which was how you went from, Aaron, that microphone has got a lot of background noise again.
Shame on you, Aaron. What is this?
He's such an old woman with that. He's been nagging me about this the whole event.
I'm sorry, James. Aaron and I are like a married couple. We'll bicker away. I do apologise for it. Yeah, so many of the comments that were left on the webpage related to this issue, and that was how you went from your initial career as a magician into investigating paranormal claims, and I think a lot of people would like to know about that.
Well, this story is relatively simple. It's an evolution, you see. I started out as a kid doing magic tricks and decided that I would do it professionally, and I did it with a fair amount of success through my life, traveled all over the world. And at the age of 60, since I had had so many people after my magic shows, my entertainments, had approached me and said, but what about, and then they'd give me some example of something they'd heard on the radio or seen on TV or read in the media, and I would try to explain to them what was really happening there, if I had enough evidence and enough experience of that particular field. And it occurred to me that after the age of 60, I wouldn't want to be dangling in straitjackets necessarily. I might like to take something a little easier physically. And I went on the lecture circuit, lecturing as I do and as I'm about to do in Canada next week, right across the continent, about the truth about this so-called paranormal, occult, and supernatural belief that people have. And it was a natural segue because I have the expertise to know how these things are done. And frankly, there's nothing new. I wish there were something new. Every now and then I would like to have somebody come up and hit me between the eyes with something that would really make me stand back and say, wow, how about that? Got to work on this one. But see, just recently, a couple of years ago, I went to South Korea and did a whole television series there investigating the paranormal. And they told me before I arrived, they said, oh, Mr. Randi, you may have a lot of experience in this field, but in South Korea, we've got psychics that you won't believe. Well, I turned to my assistant after the first 2 or 3 hours of seeing these people, and I said, it's the same old, what's the technical, crapiola. Yes, that's the term I use. The same old nonsense. It's the same sort of thing that's been going on for years.
They were correct then. They said that they had psychics that you would not believe.
That's true. Very true.
But one of the topics that was discussed briefly earlier on in the show was the idea that there are sort of like two sorts of people. I think those that go to see Aaron, that microphone.
What?
I'm not hearing anything here, but
I get a lot of background noise. Anyway, there are two sorts of people. Those that go to a magic show and walk away and think, oh, wow, wasn't it extraordinary? David Copperfield actually got chopped in two, and isn't that great? And there are those that go and think, how on earth did he do that? I fall very much into the second category. Whenever I see something, it's like, how did they do that? In relation, with magic for the time being, are there any things that you see magicians perform now where you are left thinking, how on earth did he do that? And I've got to get to know how he did that.
Well, I must say that I wish there were some performances like that. Now, I thoroughly admire when I see Copperfield or Penn and Teller or any of these folks, and I see them do their wonders. I can sit there and just smile from ear to ear and inside as well, I assure you, when I see a particular twist or a particular angle presented that I haven't seen before. But it's obvious to any magician how another magician works. We're very, very seldom puzzled. I've had a couple of comeuppances where I had to see the show a second time, for example, until I said, aha, because that's sometimes necessary because you didn't catch it the first time. But we catch it eventually, and almost always right from the very start. I really wish that one of the so-called psychics, particularly one of them, would come to me and lay something before me, and I'd say, wow, I really got to think twice about this. But it's pretty transparent to someone who's been in the business as long as I have.
Well, there are two things there. Let's just stick with the magic for the moment, because one of the tricks that I've seen you perform on several occasions, and I have rewound it and watched it again, and I'm hoping that because it's early on a Sunday morning, I might catch you off guard, and you might actually tell me how you do it. It's the 5 cards.
The ESP cards.
Yes.
Yeah, well,
come on, James. For the sake of charity, tell us how you do it.
Yes, I developed that myself, and the other magicians, with very few exceptions, that I've confided in them how it is accomplished. Banachek being one of those. But I developed that myself on a whim. I came upon a certain principle years ago, and I must say that that's one that does get the magicians. They say, they back up a little bit there and say, whoops, I don't know how that was done, perhaps. And in many cases, if they're top-notch professionals, of course, I will tell them how it's done. And it may be something they would work into their acts, or they may not prefer it, or it wouldn't be their style. But it's a damn good trick. Just very briefly.
It is a good trick, and I noticed that I haven't caught you off guard. But come on, for charity, James, you can tell us.
For charity, well, I'll be charitable and not tell you. In the case of, I have 5 giant ESP cards. I don't have any around at the moment here at the desk. And what I do is I offer them to a person in the audience, and they shuffle them up face down, and then take 1 or 2 of them, depending on how much time I've got to do, and place them in a black piece of paper, and then put it inside an envelope and seal the envelope. It's a manila envelope. And they bring it up on stage, and I announce which cards are in the envelope on which side. Now, it's not done by some heavy technical means, by sensors and radar and a few things like that. It's done very simply. But as I say, it's a damn good trick.
We're not going to get it out of you, are you?
Nope.
But going back to the cold reading thing, and again, it relates to another of the topics or common themes that were left on the comments on the webpage. I once was talking to a young lady in a bar, and I told her, I know it's awful, but I sort of told her I had some sort of abilities and whatever. I did a couple of really poorly performed, very basic magic tricks. The centerfold tear, I'm sure you're very familiar with that.
Yes.
Yeah. I then said to her, "Oh, I also have this ability to speak to dead people." And I took her hand and I said, "Oh yeah, I'm getting a J." Why do you think I chose J? Because it's the most common name. And I said, I'm getting a short name. It's like a nickname. because everyone knows their friends by a nickname as opposed to the full name. So I was doing quite well. But at that point, I took a guess and I said, it's Jack, Jake, Jack. And she said, yeah, it's Jack. But I could sense that she was becoming very, very emotional. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I just said, look, I'm sorry. I'm just playing games with you. And she was saying, no, you really have these powers. I couldn't do it. And I think that this sort of like sentiment of being dishonest with people and exploiting people's emotions is something that you've expressed before as to one of the motives that you have. Do you want to talk about that a little? It's
simply a case of having compassion and having consideration for vulnerable people. Because the people who seek out so-called psychics are grieving people. They're people that are doubtful about something. They don't know answers, and they're trying to reach beyond the grave to get the answers, or look to somebody's intuition, some psychic intuition of some kind. Now, what amazes me about that is when they contact Grandma, and the question is, where did you hide the will, Grandma? You know, Grandma could easily say, in the library on the second shelf behind this encyclopedia. But no, she says, oh, I have to go now, dear. Heaven is calling me. Goodbye. I love you. And that's the end of Grandma. They don't come up with answers, these people that claim they can come up with these things. And it's cruel. It's callous. It's really mean. It's mean and it's nasty.
I mean, I saw you at Tam London a year or so ago, and you were talking about, I almost daren't say his name, Peter Popoff.
Oh, yes.
And you spoke with an enormous amount of passion and obvious. I mean, you were being very genuine about your utter disgust for him. I don't know. Do you want to talk about Peter Popoff, or is it too early in the day?
Oh, no. Very briefly, Peter Popoff is a television evangelist who was doing very well at the time that I confronted the subject on the Johnny Carson show in this country, which was arguably the most watched television show on American television at that time. And Johnny Carson was very much of our bent of mind. He resented this sort of making use of people's vulnerability. And I did an exposure with recordings made of the messages that Peter Popoff was getting through an earphone that he had plugged into his ear. It wasn't a hearing aid. He was receiving a message from his wife, who had all of the papers in front of her in another location in the auditorium, and was reading him material saying things like, I go down the left aisle, third row, the fellow in the red shirt there, his name is George, and he has arthritis. And Peter Popoff would go down and say, God told me there's a George here. Are you George? And the man would stand up with tears coming down his face and say, God is going to heal you of that arthritis. Is that your problem? And he'd say yes, and the audience would be very much impressed, of course, because God had told Peter Popoff about this. Well, we exposed the whole thing as a total scam. And when I spoke to Carson immediately following the show while the audience was filing out, he was talking to his producer, and he said, the producer said to him, John, we're going to get letters. And John looked up at him and said, yes, Fred, and you're going to answer them. And but they did. Oh, they got a massive mail on it, mostly hate mail from people who want to believe that these things are real, for exposing Peter Popoff. Now, Popoff, Johnny Carson didn't live long enough. I'm happy in this one regard that he never found out that 2 years ago, the reports that Popoff, as a nonprofit organization, had to make to the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service here, he made $1 million more than the year in which we exposed him on the Carson show. You cannot sink these unsinkable rubber ducks. It's just incredible. He's still in business. Johnny has left us, unfortunately. I'm still around, Peter, so come on, let's take the challenge. Let's do it. But you can't stop these people, because people in the audience, that is in the public, they just don't listen.
Well, James, you probably won't recall one of the very first occasions that I had any interaction with you was an exchange of emails in relation to Peter Popoff. He's been a bane of my life for a while, and I have been trying everything I possibly can to have him removed from television in the United Kingdom. My most recent attempt, including going to my local Member of Parliament to see if he could do anything. He can't. But you might be interested. I actually have it here, and it's up for auction. But this is my collection of Peter Popoff trinkets and trivia that I've received in the last about 6 months. I mean, there's all sorts of bits and pieces. But anyway, I don't want to spoil the good show by talking about Popoff too much.
Yes.
Let's move on to the next topic. And I'm getting some feedback from somewhere.
It's you.
Is it me?
Yes, it's background noise from you. Mute Blog TV.
It is muted.
Sorry that you had to listen to us bickering, James.
Yes, I know how
not
he
right.
is. So he's difficult, isn't he?
I swear.
Yeah, I wanted to throw something else
It's
out.
not coming from me.
We were talking.
What, would you do that whilst I try and find out where this noise is coming from? Over to you, Aaron.
We were talking about this poor man who so dearly believed that what he was doing was legitimate and he was going to walk out with $1 million. I don't ever encounter people with that sort of sincere delusion. What I typically encounter are either people who know they're fraudulent outright. I mean, I'm talking about the Oral Roberts type people. Okay, and then people who want to believe so badly and yet know on some level, and I think this accounts for most people, they know on some level that what they believe is not actually true. Regardless of the speech that you get, I know in my heart of hearts that this is the absolute truth. When you put them in a situation where their beliefs will actually be tested, and they know that it really will be tested and that they will know at the end of this whether it's true or not, they reject that challenge on any excuse. And you gave some examples of this yourself. But the people that you were talking about seemed to be people that are making money at this, so it's understandable that they would do this. What I don't understand is the people who believe what they do, knowing that that belief cannot withstand scrutiny, and therefore it likely is not true, and yet they want to believe it anyway. I'm mystified at the mindset that does this.
Aaron, I would say that your choice of verbs is perhaps not exactly correct. They don't just want it to be true; they need it to be true because they have a dyed-in-the-wool belief that these things do exist, and maybe they think that, well, even though I don't exactly have them, but I'm sure they're there, so they have to do something to support belief in it in order to satisfy their own needs. They need it to be true.
And what some of these people have relayed to me, on rare occasions, I'll get a glimpse into their psyche. Someone will explain why they believe the way they do or how their philosophy works, in a sense. And sometimes I get a description that they are choosing a reality.
Yes.
And they're forcing themselves to believe. One person described it as a mind over matter sort of a thing. They believe what they believe is an act of will. And that the truth of the belief is actually irrelevant. All that matters is that they have convinced themselves that it is true, and then the effect is the same whether it is true or whether they just think it is. And again, I'm mystified at this just as much.
Well, indeed, at the same time, the victims of the scams are also to be held accountable here. Now, we went to a W.V. Grant meeting, a CBS, that's Columbia Broadcasting System in the United States. Crew went along with me to an auditorium in New York City, and we stayed at the back and we did a lot of taping and whatnot. And W.V. Grant, a famous evangelist at one time, was out there carrying on, and we saw a woman who we noticed her and we photographed her coming in with 2 canes and walking with great difficulty, and she got up into the front row there, and he called her up on stage, and she went up on stage with her 2 canes, and grabbed the canes from her and threw them away as tools of the devil and said, "Be healed," and the whole thing. And she staggered over to a wheelchair that was there, and they wheeled her off. I mean, incredible. She could barely move. And we got her when she was coming out. We confronted her with a camera, and we said, "You were healed by Peter Popoff?" And she said, waving one of her canes, she says, "Yes, hallelujah." And I said to her on camera, I said, "Now, don't you think that was rather deceptive? Because, they put you in that wheelchair." And she looked at the wheelchair and she said, "Well, yes, I guess it was, but I still believe. I still believe." And she waved her cane and she staggered off and out through the revolving doors. Astonishing, the inability these people have to face the real world. This is something that medical science might be able to help me with, but no, I'll take the easy way and I'll give money as much as I possibly can to this crook and charlatan up on the stage.
Talking of deception, though, James, is it not the case that you actually had a person that you used to send to Popoff's shows, and occasionally he would be dressed up as a woman, and he was cured of about 5 or 6 different conditions?
That's right, women's conditions that men don't have, you see, which made it even more startling, particularly to him. Yes, we sent I'm sorry, it's swept my memory at the moment. Dan Hovix, I think, something like that. Yes, I haven't been in touch with him for many, many years. He was a postal carrier from the West Coast, and he volunteered to go in there with a wig and such, and Peter Popoff healed him several times. Now, this just showed, now, mind you, he filled out the forms and everything and handed them in before Popoff came out on stage, and Popoff's wife was feeding him this information through the earpiece. So it looked very good, and he would shout hallelujah and walk around being healed. We did that to prove that that was the gimmick that Popoff was using, and we proved it beyond any shadow of a doubt and exposed him thoroughly, and yet he's still in business.
James, I'm aware of the time. I'm going to move on, change the topic slightly. You have been a huge influence to a lot of people, and one of the messages that was left on the website I would actually like to read out to you, because I think it's very touching. It comes from a person called Alan, and it says this: "Roughly 30 years ago, I was a young man and a great believer in woo-woo physics. Initially inspired by Uri Geller fixing my watch by staring at a TV camera, I spent the next 3 to 4 years reading everything I could about woo-woo physics and swallowing every bit of it with gusto. Most of the books used a literary technique to boost their scientific credibility. I now recognize this technique has a name: false document. One day, around 1981, I spotted a book in a bargain bin by a magician claiming to debunk Uri's abilities. I bought it, and out of a sense of fair-mindedness, thinking it would be easy to refute this unqualified critic. As it turned out, I read the whole book in one sitting, and it taught me more about what science and skepticism is all about than 10 years of schooling. I will forever be grateful to Randi for pulling my head out of the clouds and setting me straight. It eventually led me to university, a science degree, and a rewarding career. But more importantly, it was the initial revelation of truth that opened my eyes to the intricate and awe-inspiring beauty of the universe and unguarded by myth and magic." I imagine, James, that that's the sort of thing that motivates you and satisfies.
Oh yes, I'm very, very, very flattered and humbled by that sort of letter. But I must say at the same time that I get them just about every day via email and by postal mail, letters from people saying, "Thank you, you helped me." And that's what we're all about at the James Randi Educational Foundation. You see, we have to try to give people some information about the so-called paranormal, occult, and supernatural world out there, and particularly young people. It's very important that we do this for young people because they're just forming up their initial concepts of how the world really works, and we try to give them that to cling to and to ask them to look into it further themselves. We also supply free materials for educators who are anxious to bring this into their classrooms. So some of them have a hard time doing it because some of the parents don't like this sort of thing being taught to kids, that there is no paranormal, occult, or supernatural power in the world. But we encourage that, and we perform this service. We are a public service organization, and it is very rewarding, I must say. I can't imagine doing anything else as a profession than this. This bears fruit for me and for so many people around the world.
Well, there was going to be a build-up to two questions, and I'll take them one at a time. Firstly, obviously, as you've seen, and you're aware, you're a great influence on a lot of people. Who in your life would you look back on and say was a very influential figure for you?
Well, one person is the late Carl Sagan. I will tell you very briefly, if I may, that a couple of years ago I was sitting in my office and my colleague Andrew was sitting on the couch opposite, and I looked at my computer screen and I laughed, and Andrew looked up and said, "What's so funny?" And I read him a joke about astronomy on the page, and I did this with my hand and then froze and looked at my hand in disbelief. And Andrew said, "What's the matter?" And I turned to him and I said, "Andrew, I was about to call Carl." Now, Carl had been dead for many years at that point. I can't believe that he's not around. I was reaching for the phone to call Carl Sagan and share this joke with him. I took his number off my automatic machine at that point because I realized I had to admit that Carl was not going to be on the other end of that phone line. But he was a great inspiration for me. In his book, The Demon Haunted World, he did a whole chapter on a hoax that we pulled off in Australia and indeed in China and around the rest of the world to show people that they could easily be fooled. And it worked beautifully. Carl was a great help. And Isaac Asimov, and oh my goodness, so many other people that I've been so fortunate to rub shoulders with and to meet. And currently, Richard Dawkins is my current demigod, I must say. I'm in touch with him all the time, and he is most generous in his support of the James Randi Educational Foundation. He helps us a great deal by attending our annual meetings and lecturing for us. A giant, an intellectual, and a noble giant, I must say.
The one name that you didn't mention there, which I thought you might do, because we talked about him last year, was Richard Feynman.
Oh, yes. Well, Richard, I don't know whether we mentioned it last year, but Richard and I had a little bit of a game. I would, every time I would meet him, now that was the Nobel laureate in physics, and he lives in California. And anytime I'd be in his area, we'd agree to meet, have lunch, and have some laughs. And during that, I would usually fool him with a trick at the table or something, or identify something, whatever, some sort of mentalism trick. And he'd look at me and say, "Was that one of them?" And I'd say, "Yes, Richard, that was one of them." In other words, I had taken him unawares. I'd gotten him unprepared, and I'd fooled him. A spoon would crumble into dust or something in front of him. And so then he had the right to ask me any question as long as the answer was yes, no, or not applicable, any of those three. And just by yes and no answers and such, he always solved it. Sometimes it took him weeks. As a matter of fact, he might call me when I was living in New Jersey at the time. he might call me at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'd say, "Richard, it's 2 o'clock in the morning." No, it's only 11. Oh, yes, you're on the other coast. He knew a lot about physics, but he didn't know much about the way the Earth turns, apparently, and it gives time zones, you see. But, Dick Feynman, I had a fine time with. He always figured out what I had done by asking the yes or no or doesn't apply questions. It was a game that we played. I had great fun with him, yes.
He's if I go to a medium, or if I've ever encountered that sort of thing, I don't do it, obviously, but I mean, if someone asks me to think of someone that's deceased or whatever, I always think of Richard Feynman, because I think that if anyone can work out a way of getting out of the afterlife and communicating with us, it's going to be Dick Feynman.
Absolutely. He would do it. He'd be sitting right here in an inkstand or something like that, and he would be talking to us and laughing and shouting and trying to interrupt. Maybe he's causing the static. Now, that's possible, Aaron.
Or maybe he's causing that negative
negative
all
vibration.
around you.
Oh, terrible.
There was another question that was posted on the website, and I just want to ask you to address this. This was by Guinea Pig Dan, who says, what advice would James have to people who want to go into skepticism and testing paranormal claims? And what is the best way of addressing people who actually have these beliefs, which obviously are nonsense?
Well, to answer the last part of the question, be sympathetic. Don't look down on people who have these beliefs. They don't know any better, or they're not well enough educated, or they're not well enough informed. You have to be gentle with them because they're not fools. They're just misinformed. They're misdirected in their thinking. So be very patient with them and be sympathetic. But to get connected with the skeptical movement, yes, you can look up on the internet, look at Google. Google knows everything, as we know. And find out what the skeptical groups are in your neighborhood. And of course, if you go to www.randi, that's RANDI.org, www.randi.org, you will find all kinds of sources of material there that will allow you to contact other skeptical groups, because every major city certainly has a skeptical group in it, and they're waiting to hear from you, and they want you to join. They usually have monthly meetings and sometimes even weekly meetings. So get together with these people and talk to them, and get the books. Not necessarily my books. There are lots of good books out there. Richard Dawkins has wonderful books on the subject as well, and so do many other people.
I've got one last question for you, James, and then I'm going to open it up to Aaron and also have a look at the comments and see if there are any questions there. My last question to you is this. Given all of the things that you have done in your life, for the careers, the experiences, and the influence that you've had, if you could be remembered, and I don't want to talk about you're going to die, because I know all this homeopathic remedies are going to keep you going for years, but if you could be remembered for just one thing, what do you think that you would like to be remembered for?
I'd like to be remembered as a man who stuck his neck out and braved the initial anger of the whole magic profession for having exposed people like Uri Geller as mere conjurers, as I often put it. I just want people to remember me as somebody who dared to speak up and attained a certain notoriety in that field and was able to enlighten people somewhat. The email, as I mentioned previously, that I get just every day, I'm sure every day, without exception, from people who have been assisted by the James Randi Educational Foundation to find their way out of the morass of lies and such that the media tend to exaggerate and to promote. Just that amount of input has made it very, very valuable to me. I will close my eyes for the last time, I hope peacefully, and probably in bed. I'd like to go that way, if you don't mind, if I have a choice, and I don't. I would like to go that way, and I'll close my eyes, and I'll think, okay, I guess I did all right. I want to be remembered that way. I just want to be remembered as a human being, just another human being, a member of our species, who cared enough to make this evident to the public. I tried hard, and I did my best.
James, I said it was my last question, but I have to ask you, because I heard the account, again, going back to Tam in London last year, this sense of justice that you are obviously imbued with and doing the right thing goes back to a very early stage in your life, and the account that I recall being given in London relates to what you did in a church with when you were about 12 years old, when you realized what was. Would you like to tell people about that, please?
Well, that was the shrine of Saint Anne de Beaupré in Montreal. I was having summer holidays at that time with my grandparents in Montreal, where they lived. I lived in Toronto at the time, and the shrine was up on the hill there, and it was also called Brother Andre's Shrine. And I went up there out of curiosity, a long, winding stone staircase all the way up the hill. I'm sure it's still in the same place because it's a big money-making operation for the church, of course. And being a little kid, they had a comic book section there, and I squatted down and went through the comic books. And while I was there, there were 3 wooden bins above me, and they had crucifixes, religious charms of various kinds. And the fellow was in there. He didn't see me squatted on the floor. And there were 3 boxes. It said, blessed in Brother Andre's shrine, and then not blessed, and then blessed in Rome. And he went along, reached into the box, and threw the charms equally into each one of the boxes. He wasn't sorting them out because there was no truth in the statement anyway. And I stood up at that point, and he looked a little shocked, and I just shook my head at him and walked away. What a scam. What a cruel, cruel scam. And I looked over my shoulder, and there was a lady fingering them, anticipating that she might buy one of these for one of her grandchildren or something. I don't know. But what a shock. What a shock. And as I left, and on that particular occasion, too, there was a gentleman making his way up to the hill to the shrine on his knees. And his knees were bleeding. He was mounting that staircase on his knees, believing that he would find a miracle at the shrine of Brother Andre. That hurts. That hurts a hell of a lot. And I'm very angry at it. And I know the shrine is still there, and it's still making money, lots of money, with the same fakery. And it makes me very, very angry. And I wish we could do something about it, but we can't.
Well, I think, James, you are an inspiration for people to do something as best we can. Aaron.
One of the things that I brought up earlier in tonight's discussion was, how do you affect people that have no love or respect for truth and what is true? And this is on both sides of the spectrum. This is certainly with the people who are scamming and those that are deceived by that. I have encountered people that I don't want to identify them, but I have encountered people who have literally plunged their fingers into their ears, not figuratively, but actually literally done this, shaking their head and yelled, yeah, yeah, yeah. And we're talking about elderly people, okay? And at the fear that I might have a valid point, you know, and I have many times I've had to weigh what is truth versus the value of the delusion that this person is clinging to, and then just fine, just let her have it. Okay, but there's another level. I mean, like with Michelle Bachman, I think it's her name is Michelle. I keep forgetting names tonight. She got her law degree at Oral Roberts University. Who didn't know that Oral Roberts was a fraud? I toured that facility in shock at just the knowledge of how he acquired all that wealth to build all of that. And to me, it was an outrage. It was not well funded. I mean, it wasn't a valuable use of funds, that kind of facility. And my own father went and saw Doug Henning in Las Vegas. And, I mean, I love my dad, but he was not a critical thinker. He came home from Doug Henning convinced that Henning had actual magic powers. These were not an illusion, that it was actual magic. I'd never encountered anybody that believed a Las Vegas illusionist really had magic powers of this kind. And I couldn't convince him otherwise, because he had the philosophy that, you know, I don't care what your religion is, if you got enough sense to wipe your own ass, you can't be an atheist. That was his description. And I've known one other person who, when they brought me paperwork from the church, it was a Mormon church, and the missionaries were trying to convince me of all this stuff. When they left, and I'm explaining to someone there the kinds of things that they believe, someone who's there listens to all this and says they don't really believe that. And I said, well, yes, they do. Here it is in their own paperwork. They don't believe that. Yes, they do. Here it is right here where they say that they do. And she took it out of my hands, ripped it out of my hands, threw it in the trash can, and said, no, they don't believe that. She wouldn't look at the paper. She wouldn't let me look at the paper. She knew what it said. but she was going to deny it anyway. Now that level of self-delusion, as I said so many times today, completely escapes me, and I'm interested in your angle on that as well.
Richard, can I interrupt just for a second? I'm going to have to leave you very shortly, but before I do, I have to say a word about Doctors Without Borders and about Operation Operation Smile. Yesterday, when I got a notice from my publicity person, that I'm coming up this morning on this presentation, it suddenly occurred to me, wait a minute, I haven't given them anything in quite a while, so I clicked in on operationsmile.com, and I made a contribution of $240, and because of that $240, one child with a defect is going to be saved from a life of embarrassment, and the family will be overjoyed. It's a small contribution. And these wonderful Doctors Without Borders, they go down there and they risk their lives and their futures and their professions, of course, selflessly, with their help, and ladies and gentlemen, with your help too. This can be accomplished. So I ask you to support this charity. Would you please? And I have to leave you now. Thank you very much, Richard, for inviting me. And Aaron, always good to see you. Thank you.
James, you're an absolute star. Thank you very much for your time. Have a good day.
I will.
What a man.